The warm amber light from the pendant lamp above the dining table cast a soft glow across the room, softening the edges of the modern apartment Sam and Claire had called home for the past decade. The space was the epitome of thoughtful minimalism: clean lines, polished wood floors, a few exquisite paintings on the walls, and panoramic views of the glittering Manhattan skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The air was filled with the faint aroma of roasted garlic and thyme, remnants of the chicken Sam had cooked after a long day at work. The clink of cutlery against plates broke the silence, creating a rhythm as familiar as the hum of the city outside. Sam leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie and unbuttoning the top button of his shirt. At 40, he still had the trim figure of his college days, though the first silver threads were beginning to weave through his dark hair, and the lines around his eyes were deepened by long hours reading legal documents. He swirled his glass of red wine, watching the liquid shimmer in the light, and glanced across from Claire. She was picking idly at her food, her fork moving a piece of asparagus back and forth as if it were a riddle she couldn't solve. Her red hair, usually pulled back into a severe bun for work, fell loosely around her shoulders, but her face was tense, her green eyes staring into space. "So," Sam began, breaking the silence that had settled between them like dust, "how are things at the office? Still dodging deadlines and editors?" He smiled slightly, hoping to draw her out of the mood that had so obviously consumed her. Claire's lips twitched, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Fine," she said shortly, almost mechanically. "As always. Too many stories, too little time." She speared a piece of chicken and brought it to her mouth, chewing slowly, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the table, either at the lights of the city or at nothing. Sam nodded, not giving up. He was used to her terseness after long days at work. Claire, at 37, was a senior journalist at Hey Herald, known for her incisive investigations, which had earned her a rack of awards and a reputation as a dogged sleuth. But in recent months, her work seemed to consume her more than ever. She'd always been ambitious, but now she was working late at the office, getting home well past midnight, her phone buzzing with notifications she'd dismissed without even looking. Sam chalked it up to the hazards of her job. News stories didn't stick to a schedule, but today her silence felt heavier, like a conversation she wasn't ready to have. He tried again. "Working on something big? You seem to live at work lately. There must be something interesting." Claire's fork paused in midair, and for a moment her eyes met his, sharp and searching, as if she were deciding whether to open up. Then she shrugged and set her fork down. "The usual. A corruption investigation. City Hall. It's complicated." She reached for her glass of water, her fingers lingering on the stem, and took a long sip. Sam raised an eyebrow, catching the evasiveness. "Hard, huh? Are you going to make me read the paper to find out? Or are you going to give me an exclusive?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his tone light, but with a hint of curiosity. It was their old game. He teased, enticing details. She flirted until she gave away just enough to intrigue. But today the game felt wrong, like a melody played in the wrong key. Claire's mouth tightened, and she pushed her plate away, barely touched. "Nothing to talk about yet," she said, her voice quieter, almost apologetic. "You know how it is. Don't want to jinx the story before it's ready." He nodded, though a small knot of worry tightened in his chest. "Okay. Just don't burn out, okay? You look. I don't know. I'm a little exhausted." She gave a short laugh, more of an exhale than a genuine one. "Thank you for your concern, lawyer. I can handle it." She stood up, taking her plate and glass, and headed for the kitchen. "I have a couple more letters. Can you handle the cleaning?" Sam waved his hand. "Yeah, I'll handle it. Go save the world, one letter at a time." She gave him a quick smile, too quick, too rehearsed, and disappeared into the kitchen. The clink of dishes in the sink was followed by the soft click of her office door closing. Sam sat there, staring at the empty chair across from him, the wine in his glass suddenly tasteless. He told himself it was nothing, just the normal ups and downs of a marriage that had survived 15 years, two demanding careers, and the compromises that came with choosing each other above all else. They had always been a team, he and Claire, even when life got chaotic. No children, no pets, just the two of them and their shared ambitions, their late-night conversations about law and journalism, their dreams of one day slowing down, maybe buying a house in the country. But lately those conversations had dried up, giving way to silences that grew longer with each passing day. He stood up, clearing his desk, and tried to push away the nagging feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. It was just fatigue, he decided. Claire was under pressure, and he wasn't on vacation either. His law firm, a mid-sized firm specializing in corporate litigation, was swamped with cases, and he was pulling 12-hour shifts. Maybe they just needed a weekend away from it all, somewhere quiet, to reconnect. He made a mental note to suggest it later, maybe over morning coffee, if she didn't leave the house before he woke up. The apartment was quiet now, save for the faint hum of the dishwasher and the occasional honk of a taxi somewhere far below. Sam settled on the couch with a stack of case files, balancing his laptop on his lap. The light from the screen illuminated his face, casting shadows on the lines of concentration etched into his forehead. He was deep in reading the transcript when his phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from his assistant reminding him of a meeting the following morning. He typed a quick reply, then glanced at the time. 9:47 p.m. Claire had been in her office for over an hour. He considered knocking, offering to make her some tea, but decided against it. She always hated being interrupted in the middle of her work. Instead, he scrolled through his phone and stopped at a photo from their last vacation, a trip to Maine 2 summers ago. They were standing on a rocky beach, Claire's hair blowing in the wind, her arm through his, smiling for the camera. He remembered how they'd laughed that day, how she'd teased him about his terrible lobster roll-eating technique, how they'd stayed up late in their rented cabin, chatting about small things and big ones. He missed Claire, the one who'd stolen his French fries and argued politics with a twinkle in her eye. Lately, she'd been like a ghost in their own house, present but not quite there. He put the phone down and rubbed his eyes. Maybe he was overthinking it. Marriage wasn't a straight line. It had ups and downs, moments of distance and moments of closeness. They'd been through worse: her mother's death 5 years ago, the near collapse of his firm during the recession. They'd always come out stronger. But the silence today felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm. In her office, Claire sat at her desk, the blue light from her laptop screen reflecting off her face. The room was small but meticulously organized: shelves of journalism books and old notebooks, a framed Pulitzer Prize nomination certificate on the wall, a potted fern in the corner that she somehow managed to keep alive despite her busy schedule. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she wasn't typing. Instead, she was staring at an unsent email addressed to a name Sam had never heard Evan. The letter was short, too short for the weight it carried. "I can't stop thinking about last night. We need to talk. Tomorrow?" The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence, as if taunting her. She closed the email without sending it, her heart pounding in her chest. She leaned back in her chair, pressing her palms to her eyes, as if she could block out the guilt, the confusion, the pull she hadn't intended to feel. Evan was a colleague, a photojournalist she'd been matched with on a recent assignment. He was 35, with an easy smile and a way of listening that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. It had all started innocently: late nights at the office, coffee breaks, conversations that went on longer than they needed to. But last week, after a particularly grueling day, they'd found themselves at a bar. One drink had turned into three. His hand had touched hers, and she hadn't pulled away. That night, she'd gone home, cheeks flushed, thoughts racing, and told Sam she'd been held up in a meeting. The lie had been too easy. She wasn't sure when it had happened, when she'd started to fall in love with Evan. Maybe it was the way he challenged her ideas without making her feel smaller, or the way he noticed little things, like the way she fidgeted with her necklace when she was nervous. Or maybe it was simpler: she was alone, and he was there. She and Sam had decided long ago that children weren't for them. It had been a mutual decision, discussed late into the night, weighing their careers, their freedom, their desire to build a life on their own terms. Sam had gotten a vasectomy soon after, a practical move that felt like a vow to their shared future. But that future now felt like a script she no longer knew how to read. She opened the email again, her finger hovering over the send button. Then she closed it, stood up, and began pacing the small room. She wasn't ready to cross that line, not yet. But the fact that she was even thinking about it scared her more than she could admit. In the living room, Sam had abandoned his case files. He was scrolling through Netflix, looking for something mindless to fill the silence, when he heard the office door open. Claire came out, wrapped in a cardigan, her face pale but composed. "Hey," she said, leaning against the door frame. "Still awake?" "Yeah," he replied, putting the remote down. "I can't sleep. Save the world." She smiled faintly, but her eyes remained cold. "Something like that. I'm going to bed. I have to get up early tomorrow." He nodded, watching her cross the room, her movements careful, almost measured. "Are you okay?" he asked, the words out before he could stop them. She froze, her hand on the back of the couch, and for a moment he thought she was going to say something real, something that would break the distance between them. But then she nodded, her face softening just enough to pass for confidence. "Yep, just tired. You should get some sleep, too." He watched her disappear down the hall, watched the bedroom door click behind her. He sat on the couch for a long time, the television flickering silently, the city humming outside. The knot in his chest tightened, and he told himself it was nothing, just an ordinary evening, just a temporary setback. But deep down, he knew better. Something was changing, something he couldn't name but could feel like a crack beneath the surface of their lives. The next morning, Sam woke up to an empty bed. Claire's side was neatly tucked in, the pillow untouched. There was a note on the kitchen table. "Early meeting. Coffee is ready. See you tonight." He stared at the note, the words blurring slightly, and poured himself a cup of coffee. It was still warm, but bitter, as if it had been sitting on the stove too long. He glanced at his watch. 6:42 am. She had left hours ago. He moved through his morning routine on autopilot, shower, suit, briefcase, his thoughts drifting back to the previous evening, to the way she'd dodged his questions, the way her smiles hadn't reached his eyes. He told himself it was paranoia, that marriage was work, that they'd figure it out. But as he stepped into the elevator, the city waking up around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something more than fatigue or stress. In her office across town, Claire sat at her desk, her laptop open to the same unsent email. Evan was across the newsroom, laughing with a colleague, his camera slung over his shoulder. She looked at him for a moment, her heart clenching, then closed the email and opened a new document. She had a story to write, a deadline to meet. But as her fingers raced across the keyboard, her mind wandered to Sam, to Evan, to the life she'd built and the one she'd begun to imagine. And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure which one she wanted. The rain pounded the windows, leaving streaks of blurry water on the glass, as if the city were crying for them. Inside Sam and Claire's apartment, it was quiet, not the comfortable silence that comes after a long day, but a tense silence, as if the air were thick with anticipation of the inevitable. Sam stood at the kitchen island, chopping onions for the dinner he was making more out of habit than desire. His movements were mechanical, the knife flickering in his hand, but his thoughts were elsewhere in Claire's fleeting glances, her evasive answers, the way she seemed to slip out of their lives more and more often. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Was it just his imagination running wild with fatigue? Or was there a crack in their marriage that he had tried so hard to ignore? Claire walked into the kitchen, her footsteps almost silent on the hardwood floor. She paused at the door, arms crossed, her face paler than usual, her lips pressed tightly together. She was wearing an old gray sweater, the same one Sam had given her for their third anniversary, and for some reason it cut him to the quick, as if she was wearing it as armor rather than sentimentality. "Sam," she said quietly, her voice shaking like a string stretched to its limit. "We need to talk." He froze, the knife hovering over the cutting board. Her tone was not the usual tiredness, Not the irritation of a long day at work, but something else, something final. He slowly put the knife down and turned to her, wiping his hands on a towel. "Okay," he said, trying to keep his voice even though his heart was already pounding. "What happened?" Claire took a deep breath, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sweater. She didn't look him in the eye, her gaze fixed on the window where the rain was making patterns on the glass. "I," she began and then stopped, as if the words were stuck in her throat. She swallowed, then blurted out, "I have another person." The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Sam felt the floor shift beneath his feet, as if someone had pulled the support out from under his world. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mind refused to accept what he'd heard, clinging to the hope that this was some kind of mistake, a joke, anything but the truth. "What?" he finally managed, his voice hoarse, almost alien. "What do you mean, Claire? What other person?" She finally looked at him, and there was so much pain in her eyes, so much guilt, that he almost regretted asking the question. "His name is Evan," she said quietly but firmly. "He's a photojournalist. We work together. It didn't start out the way you think. I didn't plan it, but I fell in love with him." Sam felt the blood drain from his face. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. His mind raced, trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't want to see. All those late nights, her distance, her evasive answers, it all made sense, but it made no sense. "You fell in love," he almost laughed, but it caught in his throat, turning into a bitter lump. "Claire, we've been married for 12 years. 12 years, and you just fell in love with someone else. How is that even possible?" Claire looked down, her hands still fiddling with her sweater, but she didn't back down. "I know how it sounds," she said. "I know it's terrible, but I can't pretend anymore. I've tried, Sam. I've tried to push it down, to tell myself it would pass, that I could go back to the way it was. But I can't. I'm not happy, and I don't think you are." Her words hit him like a slap in the face. He stepped toward her, his face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Not happy? Claire, are you serious? Is this my fault now? I work, I try, I do everything to make our marriage work. And you just decided that you could just up and leave to some photographer? This isn't about you," she said, her voice sharpening. "This isn't about what you did or didn't do. This is about me, about how I feel. I don't want to live the way we do anymore, in this routine, in this silence. I want, I want to feel alive." Sam looked at her, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. He wanted to scream, wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her awake, to bring back the Claire he knew, the one who laughed at his stupid jokes, who fell asleep snuggled against him, who promised to be with him forever. But rain lashed against the windows, leaving streaks of rain on the glass, as if the city were mourning what was to come. Sam and Claire's apartment was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that was comforting after a long day, but a tense, foreboding silence. Sam stood at the kitchen island, chopping onions for the dinner he was making more out of habit than desire. His movements were automatic, the knife flickering in his hand, but his mind was elsewhere, in Claire's evasive glances, in her distance, in the way she seemed to slip away from their shared life more and more often. He sensed something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Was it just fatigue playing tricks on his mind? Or was there a crack in their marriage that he had tried so hard to ignore? Claire walked into the kitchen, her footsteps barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. She paused in the doorway, arms crossed, her face paler than usual, her lips pressed tightly together. She was wearing an old gray sweater, the one Sam had given her for their 3rd anniversary, and for some reason it tugged at his heart, as if she'd worn it for protection rather than out of fond memory. "Sam," she said quietly, her voice shaking like a taut string, "we need to talk." He froze, the knife hovering over the cutting board. Her tone was not the usual tiredness, not the irritation after a long day, but something different, something final. He slowly put the knife down and turned to her, wiping his hands on a towel. "Okay," he replied, trying to keep his voice even, although his heart was already pounding. What happened? Claire took a deep breath, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sweater. She avoided his gaze, staring out the window where the rain was making patterns on the glass. I. She began and stopped, as if the words were stuck in her throat. Then she blurted out, "I have another person." The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Sam felt the floor shift beneath his feet, as if the foundation of his world had been ripped out. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind refused to accept what he had heard, clinging to the hope that it was a mistake, a joke, anything but true. "What?" he finally managed, his voice hoarse, almost alien. "What do you mean, Claire? What other person?" She finally looked at him, and there was so much pain and guilt in her eyes that he almost regretted his question. "His name is Evan," she said quietly but firmly. "He's a photojournalist. We work together. It, it didn't start out the way you think. I didn't plan it, but I fell in love with him." Sam felt the blood drain from his face. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. His mind raced, trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't want to see. The late nights, her distance, her evasive answers, it all made sense, but the meaning was unbearable. "You fell in love?" He almost laughed, but it stuck, turning into a bitter lump. "Claire, we've been married for 12 years. 12 years, and you just fell in love with someone else. How is that even possible?" Claire looked down, her hands still fiddling with her sweater, but she didn't back down. "I know how it sounds," she said. "I know it's terrible, but I can't pretend. I've tried, Sam. I've tried to push it aside, to tell myself it would pass, that I'd go back to the way it was. But I can't. I'm not happy, and I don't think you are." Her words hit him like a slap. He stepped toward her, his face twisted in disbelief and anger. "Not happy? Claire, are you serious? Is this my fault now? I work, I try, I do everything to make our marriage work. And you just decided that you could just up and leave to some photographer." "It's not about you," she said, her voice sharper. "It's not about what you did or didn't do. It's about me, about how I feel. I don't want to live the way we live, in routine, in silence. I want to feel alive." Sam looked at her, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. He wanted to scream, to grab her by the shoulders, to shake her awake, to bring back the Claire who laughed at his jokes, who fell asleep snuggled up to him, who promised to be with him forever. "Alive?" he asked, his voice shaking with rage and pain. "What about me, Claire? About us? We built this life together. You can't just throw it away." She shook her head, her eyes shining with tears, but her voice remained firm. "I'm filing for divorce, Sam," she said, and the words sounded like a death sentence. "I can't go on. It's not fair to you, to me, to either of us. I'm leaving for Evan." Sam froze, her words echoing in his head. Divorce. After 12 years of marriage, after all the promises, all the nights spent together, all the plans for the future, she was leaving. For another man. He felt something crumble inside him, as if the foundation of their life had crumbled to dust. "No," he said, shaking his head as if he could deny reality. "No, Claire, you can't do this. We can fix this. We can talk, we can see a therapist, we can do anything, but not this. Not a divorce." "Sam," her voice wavered, but she didn't back down. "I've already made up my mind. I don't want to fix this. I want to be with Evan. I'm sorry." He looked at her, trying to find any hint of doubt in her face, but he saw only determination. His hands were shaking, and he clenched his fists to stop them. "Sorry?" he repeated, his voice growing louder. "You're ruining our lives, and all you can say is sorry. Claire, you can't just walk away. We swore to be together in good times and bad. Remember? Or does that mean nothing now?" "It means," she said, her voice breaking as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "It still means, but I can't live for vows anymore if they make me unhappy. I don't want to hate you, Sam, but I can't stay." He stepped closer, his voice becoming quieter, almost pleading. "Please, Claire, Let's just think about it. Give us a chance. We can. No, she interrupted, her voice firm despite the tears. I'm leaving. Today. The word today hit him like a hammer. He watched as she turned and headed toward the bedroom. A few minutes later, she emerged with a suitcase, the same one they had taken on trips, old and battered, with a sticker from their honeymoon in Italy. It had been full of memories, and now it was a symbol of the end. Claire, he called, his voice hoarse, broken. Don't do this. Please. She stopped at the door, her hand on the handle of her suitcase. She looked at him for a moment, and a shadow of the Claire he loved flashed in her eyes. But then she turned away. I'm sorry, Sam, she whispered and opened the door. The rain muffled the sound of her footsteps as she walked out of the apartment, leaving him alone. Sam stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by a silence that now seemed deafening. The suitcase was gone along with Claire, but her presence was still in the air, the scent of her perfume, her mug on the table, her sweater where she'd left it draped over the back of a chair. He collapsed onto the couch, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone, hoping she'd change her mind, that she'd call, that she'd say it was a mistake. But the screen remained dark. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring into space. The rain continued to pound the windows, and the city beyond them went on with its own life, uncaring of his pain. Sam felt empty, as if a part of his soul had been ripped out. 12 years of laughter, their arguments, their dreams, all shattered in one evening. He tried to remember where it all went wrong, but the memories were jumbled, dissolved in pain. At some point, he stood up and walked into the bedroom. Her side of the closet was almost empty, she'd taken only the essentials, but it was enough to make the room feel foreign. He opened the drawer of her nightstand, hoping to find something that would explain what was keeping her, but there were only small things: a hair clip, an old notebook, a pair of earrings. Nothing that could bring her back. He went back into the living room and poured himself a whiskey, even though he knew it wouldn't help. The glass was cold in his hand, but he didn't drink, just stared at the liquid as if it might provide answers. He thought about how they had decided not to have children, how he had gotten a vasectomy so that their lives would be theirs alone. It had felt right then, but now he wondered if this was the first crack in their foundation. The clock ticked, the night grew deeper, and Sam sat there, trying to pull himself together. He knew he'd have to go to work tomorrow, pretending the world hadn't ended. But for now, all he could do was sit and listen to the rain, which seemed to mourn everything he'd lost. Claire, meanwhile, sat in a taxi, her suitcase on the seat next to her. Rain splattered the windows, and she looked out over the city that had once been their home. She thought of Evan, waiting for her in his small apartment across town. She thought of Sam, his face as she left, the pain in his eyes. Guilt clenched her heart, but she knew she couldn't go back. Not now. Not when she finally allowed herself to feel. The cab pulled up outside Evan's house, and she stepped out into the rain, her hair plastered to her face. She knocked on the door, and he opened it, his eyes warm and questioning. She stepped inside, leaving 12 years of her life behind, and the door closed behind her, the final point in their story. Sam woke to silence. Not the familiar hum of the coffee machine Claire turned on every morning, not her footsteps on the hardwood floors, not her voice humming under her breath as she got ready for work. The silence was absolute, almost tangible, and it pressed on him like an uninvited guest. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, where the shadows of the morning light made patterns he'd never noticed before. The bed felt too big, too cold, and the empty half of it where Claire had once slept was now a chasm separating him from the past. He rolled over, hoping to catch a hint of her scent on the pillow, but the sheets smelled only of laundry detergent. Sam forced himself to stand, his movements sluggish, as if his body was resisting the day. Everything in the living room was the same as yesterday. Her mug on the table, a forgotten book on the couch, her old sweater tossed carelessly over the back of a chair. These little things, so familiar, now seemed like artifacts of another life, a life that had ended the night before when Claire had left with her suitcase in hand. He made coffee, but didn't drink it, just watched the steam rise from the cup and dissolve into the air. The apartment that had once been their home felt foreign now, as if the walls knew that everything had changed. Sam walked into the kitchen, where a photograph hung on the refrigerator. He and Claire on the roof of a Brooklyn bar, laughing, drinks in hand. It had been 13 years ago, a year after they'd met. He pulled the photo off the magnet and ran his finger down her face, trying to remember what had made her glow so much in that moment. They met at a mutual friend's party in a cramped East Village apartment that smelled of cheap beer and played too loud jazz. Sam was 27, had just gotten a job at a law firm, and was feeling on top of the world. Claire, then an aspiring journalist, had come into his life like a whirlwind. She was arguing with someone about politics, her eyes bright and her words flying so fast that Sam couldn't look away. She caught his eye across the room and, instead of looking embarrassed, winked at him as if challenging him. "Do you always stare at strangers like that?" she asked later, approaching with a bottle of beer in her hand. "Only the ones who look like they're going to win an argument with half the room," he replied, and she laughed, throwing her head back, her laughter so infectious that he knew immediately that he was screwed. They talked until the early hours, moving from politics to music, from dreams to silly jokes. She told him how she had wanted to be a journalist ever since she stole her father's tape recorder as a child and began recording interviews with the neighborhood cats. He confessed that he had chosen law because he wanted to be like the heroes of old lawyer movies, although the reality was much more prosaic. By morning, they were sitting on the fire escape, watching the first rays of sunlight, and Sam realized that he wanted to see her every day of his life. A year later, they moved in together, and 3 years later, they were married. It was a small wedding at City Hall, just close friends and her mother, who cried as she hugged them both. They were young, ambitious, and full of plans. They had decided not to have children not because they didn't want them, but because their lives were full, their careers took up time, and their love seemed enough to fill all the empty spaces. Sam had a vasectomy a year after their wedding, and Claire had squeezed his hand, whispering, "It's just you and me always." The words now sounded like a taunt. Sam put the photo down and took out his phone. He opened their chat, and the last message was from him. "Call me, please. We need to talk." Sent yesterday, right after she left. There was no answer. He dialed her number, but after 3 rings, the answering machine came on. Her voice, cheerful and professional, asked him to leave a message. He hung up without saying a word and wrote another message. "Claire, please just talk to me. We can fix this." He looked at the screen, expecting the 3 dots to appear, but nothing happened. The days dragged on, each one a repetition of the last. Sam went to work, had meetings, smiled at clients, but it was all mechanical, as if he were playing a role in someone else's life. At home, he wandered around the apartment, collecting her things that she had left behind. Her favorite mug with the inscription Journalist of the Year, her notebooks with notes, her old scarf that still smelled like her perfume. He couldn't bring himself to throw them away, but he couldn't bear to have them out there. He put them all in a box and put them in the closet, hoping that would help, but the emptiness only grew. A week after she left, a summons appeared in the mailbox. Sam opened the envelope, his fingers shaking as he pulled out the official form application for divorce. Claire's name was next to his, their signatures, or rather, her signature and the blank space where he should have been. He read the document 3 times, each word cutting into his mind like a knife. She wasn't kidding. She really wanted a divorce. He called her number again, but she didn't answer. He called again, left messages, texted, but to no avail. Claire had disappeared from his life as suddenly as she had appeared 13 years ago. He tried to contact her colleagues, but they either didn't know where she was or wouldn't talk. One of them, an older editor Sam had once met at a company party, had said only, "Give her time, Sam. She'll figure it out." But time was exactly what he didn't have. Sam sat in his office, staring at the pile of papers he had to sort through. His coworkers noticed he was quieter, but no one asked what was wrong in their world. Personal drama was left outside the door. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept returning to Claire, to their life, to where it had all gone wrong. He remembered their trips, their arguments, their nights lying in the dark planning the future. He remembered how she laughed when he spilled wine on her dress on their 5th anniversary, how she held him when his father died, how proud she was of him when he won his first big case. These memories had been vivid, clear, but now they cut like shards of glass. He began searching for answers, going over their past. Maybe he was too busy with work. Maybe he hadn't noticed her signals. They had long since stopped having heart-to-heart conversations. Their conversations were limited to small matters. Who would buy groceries? Who would pay the bills? But he thought it was normal, that this was how all couples lived after so many years. He hadn't seen her drifting away, or maybe he didn't want to. One evening, after yet another unanswered call, he opened an old notebook of hers he'd found in a box. It wasn't her work notebook, but a personal one, filled with notes she'd made for herself. There were notes on articles, sketches of ideas, but between the pages he found something else. A short entry, dated a few months ago. I don't know who I am anymore. I write, I work, I live, but everything feels empty. Where is Claire who wants to change the world? Where did Sam and I get lost? He closed the notebook, his throat tightening. She had felt it then, but he hadn't noticed. He had been too busy with his own affairs, his own victories, his own plans, to see that she was drowning. He wanted to call her, to tell her that he understood now, that they could start over, but he knew she wouldn't answer. The divorce papers sat on his desk like an indictment. He was supposed to sign them, see a lawyer, but every time he picked up his pen, his hand froze. Signing would mean admitting it was over, that 12 years of their life had meant nothing. He wasn't ready. Instead, he started writing her letters, not emails, but real ones, on paper, as if that would bring her back. He wrote about how much he missed her, how sorry he was, how he wanted to try again. He mailed them to her office address, but he didn't know if they were getting through. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, he drove to her office. The rain had long since stopped. The city was aglow with neon lights, but to Sam it was gray and empty. He stood at the entrance Toth Herald, looking at the windows where the lights were on. He knew she was there, or had been there, or maybe had already gone to Evan. He didn't know who Evan was, but he pictured him young, charming, the one who had given Claire what he, Sam, hadn't. He stood there for an hour, maybe two, until the guard asked him to leave. The divorce proceedings began a month later. Claire hired a lawyer, a cold-voiced woman who spoke to Sam as if he were a client rather than a man whose life was falling apart. They divided up their property, their apartment, their savings, their lives. Sam didn't argue he didn't want any of it unless Claire was in it. He signed the papers, but each stroke of the pen was a blow. The apartment grew emptier. He sold their dining room table because he couldn't sit there alone anymore. He put away her photographs, but her shadow remained in every corner. He tried to move on with his life, going to work, seeing friends, even going on a date, but it all felt foreign. He was a lawyer, used to solving problems, but this was a problem he couldn't solve. Sometimes he imagined her living with Evan, laughing with him, building a new life. The thought was excruciating, but he couldn't stop it. He wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. He loved her, even now, even after everything. And that love was the only thing keeping him in that empty apartment, where every day was a reminder of what he had lost. Sam stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. His blonde hair, already streaked with gray, was neatly combed, but there were shadows under his eyes that no amount of coffee could hide. It had been 4 months since Claire had left, and even though their marriage was legally over, her absence still felt like a raw wound. Tonight, he was going on another date, his third in a month, at the insistence of his friends, who were tired of seeing him as his own ghost. He didn't want to go, but he agreed because standing around was even worse. The apartment, once their home, was now a battleground of memories. He'd replaced the dining room table, put away the photographs, but every corner still held her shadow. The spot on the couch where she liked to read, the shelf of her books he couldn't bring himself to throw out, even the smell of the coffee she always brewed too strong. Sam tried to fill the void with activities, long hours at the office, morning runs, even the bathroom renovation. He'd started to distract himself. But the silence returned every night, reminding him that he was alone. His friends, especially Mike, a colleague at the firm, were insistent. "You can't sit in this apartment like a mausoleum forever," Mike had said over beers last week. "Meet someone, Sam. Just try it. Not to get married right away, but to live on." Sam nodded, though the idea seemed ridiculous. How could he start something new when the old wound was still bleeding? But he agreed, more out of tiredness of arguing than desire. Their first date was with Allison, a schoolteacher Mike had found for him through a mutual friend. She was sweet, with a warm smile and a habit of adjusting her glasses when she was nervous. They met at a cozy West Village cafe where coffee was served in ceramic cups and the air smelled of freshly baked goods. Allison talked about her students, about the time one of them gave her a drawing of a cat, and Sam tried to listen, to nod, to smile. But his mind wandered. He looked at her hands, delicately holding her cup, and remembered the way Claire fidgeted with her necklace when she was excited. Allison asked about his job, and he said something about corporate law, but his voice sounded mechanical, like a memorized script. Toward the end of the evening, she touched his arm gently and said, "You're a nice guy, Sam, but I don't think you're here." He apologized, paid for the coffee, and left, feeling even more lost. The second date was with Laura, a marketer he'd found on a dating app. She was energetic, with a loud laugh and a tendency to interrupt to tell her story. They dined at a trendy Soho restaurant where the waiters moved with the grace of dancers and the menu was printed on craft paper. Laura talked about her career, her travels, her plans to open her own agency. Sam tried to make conversation, but her enthusiasm was like a light that was too bright blinding, not warming. When she suggested they go to a bar after dinner, he excused himself from an early meeting and went home. In the cab, he realized he couldn't remember what color her eyes were. Today's date was with Rebecca, a family law attorney he'd met at a legal conference. She was smart, outspoken, with a sharp sense of humor that reminded him of Claire in her prime. It was both intimidating and compelling. They'd arranged to meet at a live music bar in the East Village, a place where the thrum of guitars mingled with the hum of conversation. Sam arrived early, grabbed a table by the window, and ordered a whiskey to steady his nerves. He watched the people scurrying under umbrellas. It had started to rain again, and thought that maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe Rebecca would be different. Maybe he'd be able to feel something. She appeared 10 minutes later, her dark hair slightly damp from the rain, her smile small but confident. They hit it off quickly, discussing work, clients, and the absurdities of the legal system. She told him about a case in which a couple had argued over a dog, and Sam actually laughed for the first time in weeks. But when she asked about his life, why he was single, he hesitated. He mentioned the divorce, but didn't elaborate, and her eyes softened, almost sympathetic. "It's hard," she said, stirring her cocktail. "My divorce was 5 years ago. The first few months I thought I'd never get over it. But time helps. And new people, too." Sam nodded, but her words didn't hit him. He wanted them to, wanted to feel hope, but all he felt was emptiness. Rebecca was wonderful, smart, attractive, with a spark that might have ignited something in another life. But he wasn't in that life. He was in this one, where every step he took was a reminder of Claire. They said goodbye around midnight, exchanging numbers and promising to call each other. But as Sam walked to the subway in the drizzle, he knew he wouldn't call. Not because he didn't like her, but because he wasn't ready. His heart still belonged to Claire, even if she didn't want it. Sam didn't do any research on Claire, but she found him anyway, like radio waves penetrating walls. Their mutual friends, trying to be tactful, still mentioned her in conversations. Mike, drunk at a party, blurted out that he'd seen Claire at a cafe with a guy, tall, with a camera, like a photographer. Sam nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat, and changed the subject. Lisa, Claire's friend from the editorial office, once wrote to him, asking how he was holding up, and mentioned between the lines that Claire was working on a big case and looked happy. That word, happy, cut him harder than he expected. He wanted her to be happy, but not like this, not without him. He knew she was living with Evan, one of his colleagues at the law firm, whose brother worked at Hey Herald, said that Claire and her new boyfriend often showed up together at work events. Sam hadn't asked, but the rumors had reached him like shipwrecks washing up on the beach. He imagined her in a new apartment, in a new life, laughing the way she used to laugh with him, making plans that didn't include him. The thoughts were excruciating, but he couldn't stop them. Sometimes he checked her social media profile, even though he knew it was a bad idea. She rarely posted anything personal, but she had recently posted a photo from an exhibition, standing next to a man whose face was cropped out of the frame, but Sam knew who it was. She was wearing the same necklace he had given her for her birthday 5 years ago. He closed the app, but the image remained in his mind. Sam tried to fill his days to keep from drowning in melancholy. He joined a gym, even though he hated treadmills. He began cooking elaborate meals, even though he hated eating them alone. He even attended a photography class, thinking it would help him understand what attracted Claire to Evan, but he left after half an hour, unable to concentrate. Everything he did was an attempt to prove to himself that he was moving forward, but every night he returned to an empty apartment, where the silence reminded him of his defeat. One night, after yet another sleepless hour, he wrote her a letter. Not an email, but a real one on paper, like the ones he'd sent in the first weeks after she'd left. He wrote about how much he missed her, how he wished he'd noticed her pain sooner. He wrote about his life, which now seemed like a shadow, and how he wished he could just talk. He didn't send the letter he knew she wouldn't answer, but the act of writing felt like a confession, like a way to release the pain that was choking him. One cold March morning, with the city shrouded in gray fog, Sam received a letter from Claire's lawyer. The divorce was final, the property divided, their lives officially separated. He had signed the final papers weeks ago, but this letter was like the final blow. He laid it on the table and stared at the envelope for a long time without opening it. There was nothing new in it, just formalities, but they made the end real. He stepped out onto the balcony, despite the cold, and looked out over the city. Manhattan was humming with life. Taxis honking, people hurrying down the sidewalks, skyscraper lights winking in the fog. Sam thought about how he and Claire had dreamed of a life here, how they had made plans that were now crumbling like sand. He wasn't ready to move on, but he knew he had to try. Not for Claire, not for his friends, but for himself. That night, he called Rebecca. Not for a date, just to talk. She answered, her voice warm, and they talked for an hour, discussing everything from work to their favorite books. It wasn't love, it wasn't even the beginning of something new, but it was a step. A small, tentative step, but a step forward. And in that empty apartment, with Claire's shadow still hovering, Sam felt for the first time in months that he might be able to breathe again. The year passed like a subway train flashing through a tunnel, fast, noisy, leaving behind only a buzz in his ears. Sam stood at the window of his apartment, looking out over Manhattan, which now seemed less like home than the backdrop to his new, still unclear life. It had been a year since Claire had left, and though her shadow still flickered in the corners of his mind, she was no longer the center of his world. He had learned to live with the emptiness, filling it with work, morning runs, occasional visits with friends, and the books he was finally reading for more than just distraction. The apartment, once their home, was now his own repainted walls, a new couch, the absence of her things. He had even begun to get used to the silence, which no longer seemed so deafening. Sam had changed. His hair was a little longer than he usually wore it, and there was a new depth in his eyes, not just from the pain, but from the experience he'd been through. He no longer wrote to Claire, or checked her social media profiles, or looked for her in conversations with mutual friends. He hadn't forgotten her, it was impossible to forget 12 years of her life. But he'd learned to keep those memories at arm's length, like old photographs you looked at once a year and then put back in a box. His life was moving forward, slowly but surely. He'd even started dating Rebecca, a lawyer he'd met on a previous date. It wasn't passion or great love, but her presence, her witty remarks, her quiet confidence brought him a peace he hadn't known in a long time. But the past, as it turns out, is not so easy to let go. It returns at the most unexpected moment, like a letter lost in the mailbox, but still finding its addressee. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday. Sam was sitting in his office, sorting through paperwork for a new case, a complex corporate dispute that required his full attention. His colleague Mike, as always, barged in without knocking, coffee and phone in hand. "Sam, you're not going to believe what I just heard," Mike said, plopping down in the chair across from her. His eyes were bright with the gossip he always collected with the deftness of a reporter. "Remember Claire? You know, your ex?" Sam froze, his fingers frozen on the keyboard. Claire's name, spoken so casually, still stung, though he thought he had outgrown the reaction. He leaned back in his chair, trying to look unconcerned. "What's wrong with her?" he asked, his voice even, but something inside him stirred, like an old scar that began to ache from the change in weather. Mike leaned forward, his tone conspiratorial. "I heard from a friend who works in the Herald her new boyfriend, that photographer Evan, he dumped her. Left her for some other woman. It's like a scene from a bad TV show. They say she's a total mess." Sam felt his heart take a strange leap, not joy, not relief, but something more complex, a mixture of surprise and the shadow of an old pain. He didn't know what he'd expected to hear, but it wasn't this. Claire, who'd left him for a new life, for Evan, was now betrayed herself. It was almost poetic, but instead of satisfying, it left him feeling empty. "How do you know that?" he asked, trying to hide his interest. "And why should I care?" Mike shrugged, taking a sip of coffee. "Thought you'd be curious. A friend of mine told me she quit the paper a couple weeks ago. Just packed up and left. No one really knows where she went. They say she skipped town altogether." Sam nodded, his gaze falling to the papers in front of him, but he could no longer see the text. Claire had quit, moved away. It was so unlike her, the woman who lived for her work, who fought for every line of her articles. He tried to imagine her somewhere else, in another life, but the images were blurry, like photographs taken out of focus. "Well, it's her life," he said finally, trying to close the subject. "I don't care." But it wasn't true. After Mike left, Sam sat there, staring at the screen, the cursor blinking on a blank document. He didn't want to admit that the news about Claire had hurt him. Not because he still loved her, or maybe he did, but not in the same way, but because her failure mirrored his own. She'd left for something better, for freedom, for love, but now she was where he'd been a year ago, alone with her hopes dashed. That evening, Sam met Rebecca at a small Italian restaurant in Chelsea. She sat across from him, her dark hair pulled back into a loose bun, her eyes searching his face as he talked about his day, leaving out the details of his conversation with Mike. Rebecca was sensitive but not intrusive, which was one of the reasons Sam felt comfortable with her. She didn't try to fill the silence with empty words, but she knew how to ask questions that got him talking. "You seem a little thoughtful today," she said, cutting off a piece of tiramisu. "Did something happen?" Sam hesitated. He didn't want to drag Rebecca into his old dramas, but her eyes were so open that he decided to be honest. "I found out something about Claire," he said, twirling his wine glass. "Her relationship didn't work out. She quit her job and apparently left town." Rebecca nodded, her face calm but a hint of sympathy in her eyes. "That must be hard to hear, even if you think you've let it go." "I don't know what I feel," he admitted, looking at the tablecloth. "I don't miss her. Or maybe I do, but not like I used to. It's just weird to think that she failed too. I thought she found what she was looking for." Rebecca reached out and lightly touched his fingers. "Sometimes people run away from one life, thinking another will be better. But the grass isn't always greener. You know that better than anyone." He smiled weakly, grateful for her understanding. They continued eating dinner, talking about other things, her latest case, a new bar that had opened nearby, but thoughts of Claire still lingered in the back of his mind. Meanwhile, Claire was far from New York. She rented a small apartment in Portland, Maine, a city she chose almost by accident because it was far enough away to start over, but vibrant enough to not feel buried alive. Her new life was quiet, almost ascetic, a small studio overlooking the bay, freelancing for a few online publications, walking along the waterfront where the breeze smelled of salt and freedom. But that freedom didn't bring relief. The breakup with Evan was sudden and painful. She thought she'd found in him what she'd been missing with Sam: passion, attention, a sense of being seen. But Evan was not what he seemed. A few months after she moved in with him, he began to pull away, spending his evenings with friends she'd never met. And then she found messages on his phone from another woman younger, with bright eyes and an easy smile. When she confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. "It's not what you think," he said, but his words were empty. "It's just, you're too serious, Claire. I need something lighter." Those words haunted her. Too serious. She, who had given up 12 years of marriage for him, a career that was her life, was too serious. She packed her things that night, leaving his apartment without a word. Dismissal from the Herald was the next step. She couldn't work any longer where every corner reminded her of him, of her mistake. She wanted to disappear, and Portland became her refuge. But even here, in this quiet city, she couldn't escape herself. She sat in her small apartment, staring at her laptop, where open documents with her articles sat next to blank pages she couldn't fill. She thought about Sam not every day, but often enough to feel a twinge of guilt. She knew she'd broken his heart, but now her own was broken, and she didn't know how to put it back together. Sam moved on with his life, trying not to look back. He and Rebecca were seeing each other more often, their relationship calm, without drama, but also without the fire that had once connected him with Claire. Sometimes he wondered if he was capable of love again, or if his heart was in the past, in the apartment where he and Claire had built their life. But Rebecca was patient, and her presence made him feel less alone. He still heard from Claire from time to time, though it was only in fragments now. Her friend Lisa had mentioned to Mike that Claire had written to her from Maine, but she hadn't gone into detail. "She sounds lost," Lisa had said, and the words stuck in Sam's head. He didn't want to feel sorry for her, but he couldn't help but think about how she must feel alone, betrayed, like he had felt a year ago. One evening, Sam returned home after a long day and found a postcard in his mailbox. It was simple, with a view of the Portland lighthouse. On the back were just a few words: "Sorry for everything. K." The handwriting was hers, uneven, rushed, as if she had written without giving herself time to change her mind. Sam stared at the card for a long moment, his fingers fiddling with its edges. He wasn't sure if he was angry, relieved, sad, or all three. He didn't reply, but he didn't throw the card away. It sat on his desk, a reminder that the past was never completely gone. Sam's life continued to move forward. He'd gotten a promotion at his firm, started running marathons, even taken up the habit of cooking for Rebecca and her friends on weekends. He wasn't happy in any real sense, but he was on his way to something new. Claire, wherever she was part of his story, but not his present. He knew that her downfall wasn't a victory for him, just another chapter in their complicated, painful history. And as he stood at his apartment window, looking out over a city that still breathed the memories they'd shared, he realized he was ready to let go not of her, but of the pain that had held him captive for so long. Sam straightened his tie in front of the mirror in his bedroom and grimaced. The reflection showed a man who looked better than he felt: neatly trimmed hair, a navy suit that fit like a glove, and an easy smile that had been rehearsed for a night he'd rather skip. A benefit for a local law association wasn't exactly the kind of place Sam wanted to spend his Friday night. He'd happily stayed in with a beer and an old movie, but his coworkers, especially Mike, had left him no choice. "You can't hide forever," Mike said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Besides, there's an open bar and a lot of big shots there. Networking, Sam, networking." Sam rolled his eyes, but agreed, more out of a desire to avoid controversy than enthusiasm. The night was cool, and the city was as vibrant as ever. Manhattan was aglow with lights, skyscrapers reflected in puddles left by the morning rain. Sam walked the sidewalk, his coat flapping in the wind, his mind racing with ideas for how to get through the evening without making small talk. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, but his job required him to be present at such events. The law firm where he was now a senior partner expected him to represent them, to shake hands, smile, and pretend to be interested in hearing about others' accomplishments. He was good at it. Years of practice in the courtroom had honed his ability to hide his emotions, but today the mask seems heavier than usual. The reception was being held in the ballroom of a downtown hotel, a high-ceilinged room with crystal chandeliers and marble columns that gave it the appearance of a palace. Guests dressed in formal suits and evening gowns moved between the refreshment tables and the bar, their laughter and snatches of conversation merging into a low hum. Sam picked up a glass of whiskey and took a position by the window overlooking the city lights. He nodded to a few acquaintances, exchanged a few words with a partner from a rival firm, but mostly kept to himself, watching the crowd. His gaze swept over the faces lawyers, judges, philanthropists, a few journalists covering the event. He was about to walk over to Mike, who was arguing animatedly with someone about tax law, when his attention was drawn to a figure at the far end of the room. The woman was standing alone, leaning against the wall, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her red hair, slightly disheveled, was pulled back into a loose bun, and she was wearing an old black jacket that seemed too big for her slight frame. Something about her posture, the way she fiddled with the hem of her sleeve, made Sam's heart skip a beat. He knew that gesture. He knew her. Claire. He froze, the glass in his hand almost slipping. She was here, in this room, a few meters away. A year had passed since their last meeting, since the night she left their apartment, leaving him in a silence that then seemed eternal. He thought she was in Portland, that she had disappeared from his life, but here she was, alive, real, but somehow different. Not the Claire he remembered, with her confident posture and sharp gaze. This Claire looked lost, like someone who had gotten lost in a city where she once knew every alley. Sam took a step back, retreating into the shadow of the column so she wouldn't see him. His heart was pounding, his mind racing. What was she doing here? Why was she back? And why did she look like the world had crushed her? He knew from mutual friends that her life with Evan had fallen apart, that she'd quit her job the Herald and left, but seeing her here in this room was like a punch in the gut. He wanted to leave, just turn around and walk out, but his legs wouldn't obey him. Instead, he looked at her, trying to figure out what had changed. Her face was paler than he remembered, her cheekbones sharper, and there were shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. Her clothes, the same jacket she'd worn in their early years, and a plain black skirt looked shabby, as if she hadn't bought anything new in a long time. She held a glass of water in her hand, but she wasn't drinking, just twirling it in her fingers, as if it were the only thing holding her in place. Sam noticed that she still had her necklace on, the one he'd given her for her birthday all those years ago, and it made him feel a strange mixture of anger, nostalgia, pity. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. He could have simply walked away, pretended he hadn't seen her, continued his evening as if nothing had happened. But something, curiosity, old wounds, or perhaps just human compassion, pushed him forward. He set his glass down on the nearest table and walked toward her, his steps slow but determined. Claire noticed him when he was already a few steps away. Her eyes widened and she straightened up, as if preparing for a blow. The glass in her hand shook, and a few drops of water spilled onto the floor. "Sam," she breathed, her voice quiet, almost broken. You're here." He paused, keeping his distance, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets to hide the way they were shaking. "Yeah," he said, his tone cool, measured, like a courtroom. "Didn't expect to see you. Thought you'd be in Portland." She looked away, her fingers tightening around her glass. "I came back for a couple of weeks to work." Sam nodded, but he didn't believe it. She didn't look like someone who was here on business. Her clothes, her posture, her voice, everything screamed that she was on the edge. But he didn't want to show that he noticed. He didn't want to give her control over his emotions again. "Work then," he said, his voice even but bitter. "How are things going?" "Apparently, not as you planned." Claire flinched, as if his words were a physical blow. She looked up at him, her eyes shining, not with tears, but with something else, weariness, perhaps, or shame. "It's not," she admitted quietly. Everything went wrong. Sam waited for her to continue, but she remained silent, her gaze falling to the floor again. He felt two desires warring within him: to walk away, leaving her with her problems, and to ask what was wrong, to try to understand. He chose the latter, though he wasn't sure why. "What are you doing here, Claire?" he asked, softening his tone, but not completely. "This doesn't seem like your place. You hated this kind of reception." She smiled faintly, but it was bitter. I help with the coverage. Freelance. One of the organizers hired me to write an article." She hesitated, then added, "This is temporary. I'm just trying to stay afloat." Sam looked at her, trying to connect this Claire with the Claire he knew. That Claire had been fired, ambitious, brash, willing to argue with editors and punch through walls for a good story. This Claire looked like the fire in her had burned out, leaving only embers. He wanted to feel satisfaction, maybe even schadenfreude. She deserved it, after ruining his life. But instead, all he felt was emptiness. "Afloat," he repeated, his voice almost emotionless. "So how's it working out for you? Portland, freelancing, a new life?" She swallowed, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her jacket. "It's not working," she said, her voice barely audible. "I thought I could start over, but—" She paused, her eyes growing brighter, and she blinked quickly to clear away the tears. "I have nothing, Sam. No job, no home. I don't even know where I'll be tomorrow." Her words hung between them like a cold wind. Sam stared at her, his mind trying to process what he'd heard. Claire, who had always been so confident, so driven, was now standing before him, admitting that her life had fallen apart. He wanted to say something harsh, to remind her how she'd walked away, how she'd left him alone, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he asked, "What? What happened to Evan?" She flinched, her face twisting as if he'd touched an open wound. He left, to someone else." She tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Funny, huh? I thought I'd found something real, and he turned out to be just like everyone else." Sam was silent, his hands balled into fists in his pockets. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to scream, "You deserve it." Another part of him, the part that still remembered her laughter, her warmth, her promises, wanted to reach out, to comfort her. But he did neither. He just stood there, looking at her, and felt old wounds opening, but not as painfully as before. "I'm sorry," he finally said, though he wasn't sure he meant it. "But you chose this path." Claire nodded, her lip trembling. "I know, and I don't blame you if you hate me. I don't know what to do next." Sam looked at her, her words echoing in his head. He didn't hate her, he'd gotten over that long ago. But he didn't know how to help her, didn't know if he wanted to. Their conversation hung in the air, unfinished, full of unspoken words. He could tell she was waiting for something from him: forgiveness, maybe support, but he wasn't ready to give her anything. Not yet. The crowd around them continued to hum, the music blaring from the speakers, but for Sam and Claire the world had narrowed to this moment, to their eyes meeting for the first time in a year. He knew their conversation wasn't over, that this evening was just the beginning of something new, but what that something would be he couldn't yet figure out. The hotel ballroom was still alive with voices, the clinking of glasses, and the soft music, but for Sam and Claire the world had narrowed to the narrow space between them. They stood against the wall, away from the crowd, where the light from the crystal chandeliers didn't reach them, leaving them in soft shadow. Claire still held her glass of water, her fingers gripping the glass so tightly her knuckles were white. Sam looked at her, his face as unreadable as the mask he wore in the courtroom, but inside him a swirl of emotions swirled: anger, pity, weariness, and something else he couldn't name. A year ago, he dreamed of a moment like this: to see her, to hear her voice, to have the chance to say everything that had been pent up. But now, as she stood before him, lost and broken, he felt nothing but emptiness. Claire took a deep breath, her shoulders shaking slightly as she finally looked up at him. Her green eyes, which he had once known better than his own, now seemed dull, as if someone had turned off the light in them. Sam, she began, her voice hoarse, almost pleading. I know I don't deserve your time. I know I hurt you. And I want to say I'm sorry for everything. The word sorry hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Sam felt his jaw tighten, his hands balling into fists in his pockets. He'd been waiting for this apology for months, imagining her coming back, begging for forgiveness, but now that it had come, it brought no relief. It was as empty as her promises a year ago when she'd left, leaving him in their apartment with a suitcase of memories. Sorry? He asked, his voice cold, almost alien. Is that all you can say, Claire? After everything you've done? You think one word can fix 12 years? She winced, her face twisting, but she didn't look away. I don't think I can fix anything, she said quietly. I know what I did. I ruined our lives, Sam, and I live with it every day. He looked at her, trying to find the catch in her words, but all he saw was sincerity, or perhaps the shadow of it. Claire had always been able to speak in a way that made her sound convincing, but now there was no confidence in her voice that had once made her invincible. She looked like someone who had lost a battle that no one knew about. What do you want from me, Claire? He asked, his tone sharp but also weary. Did you come back to apologize? Or is there something else you want? Because I'm not in the mood to play your games. She shook her head, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her jacket, the old, threadbare one he remembered from their first dates. I'm not playing, she said. I just wanted to see you, to say I'm sorry, and, she trailed off, her voice breaking. I have nowhere to go, Sam. I have nothing. The words hit him harder than he expected. He knew her life was in shambles, rumors of her breakup with Evan, of her being fired from her job. The herald of her flight from the city had reached him like scraps of old newspaper. But hearing it from her, seeing her like this broken, without the fire that had once made her Claire, was something else entirely. He wanted to feel satisfaction, wanted to tell himself that she deserved it, but instead he felt only emptiness, mixed with something that felt suspiciously like pity. What do you mean, nowhere to go? He asked, his voice a little softer, though he still kept his distance. What happened, Claire? Tell me. She took a deep breath, her gaze darting to the crowd as if she were looking for salvation, but then back to him. Everything fell apart, she began, her voice quiet but the words coming out quickly, as if she were afraid that if she stopped, she wouldn't be able to continue. After I left, I thought things would be different with Evan. I thought he was what I was missing. But he wasn't who I thought he was. He left for another woman, Sam. A few months after I moved in with him. I was so blind, I didn't see him drifting away until it was too late. Sam listened, his face unreadable, but something stirred inside. He knew this pain, the betrayal, the feeling of the ground slipping out from under him. He had experienced it when she left him, and now, looking at her, he saw his own pain reflected back at him. But he didn't want to pity her. He didn't want to give her power over him again. And then what? He asked, his tone even but steely. You quit, you left. What brought you back? Claire swallowed, her fingers still fiddling with her jacket. I couldn't stay in Harold, she said. Every day there reminded me of him, of how I'd screwed everything up. I moved to Portland, thinking I could start over. I freelanced, wrote for small publications, but... She trailed off, her voice breaking. It didn't work. I lost everything, Sam. My reputation, my connections, my savings. I was living in a tiny apartment I could barely afford, and when the money ran out, I just didn't know what to do. I moved back to New York because at least here I had a chance of getting a job. But even that, she shook her head, her eyes shining with the tears she was trying to hold back. I'm staying with a friend, but she can't keep me forever. I'm at rock bottom. Sam looked at her, his mind trying to process her words. Claire, who had once been a star journalist, whose articles were read by thousands, now stood before him, admitting that her life was falling apart. He saw her vulnerability, her desperation, but his heart remained cold. He didn't want to be the one to save her. Not after she had ruined his life. I'm sorry things turned out this way, he said finally, his voice even almost formal. "But I don't understand what you expect from me. You left, Claire. You choose your path. And now that it's led you to a dead end, you think I should pull you out." She flinched, her face growing even paler. "I don't expect you to save me," she said quickly. "I don't deserve this. I wanted you to know. I wanted to apologize. And maybe I was hoping." She trailed off, her voice growing even quieter. "I was hoping that maybe you didn't hate me enough to at least listen." Sam felt his anger flare, but he pushed it down, clenching his fists in his pockets. "I don't hate you," he said, and it was true, though he wasn't sure when it had become true. "But I'm not going to pretend that everything is okay. You ruined our lives, Claire. You walked away without so much as a backward glance. And now here you are, telling me how bad it is, but I'm not the one who should fix it." Her lips trembled, but she nodded as if she'd been expecting it. "I know," she whispered. "I know I have no right to ask for help. But I don't know how to get out. I have nothing, no job, no money, not even a place to live. I'm lost, Sam." He looked at her, her words echoing in his head. He saw her pain, her despair, and part of him the part that still remembered their years together, their laughter, their dreams wanted to reach out, to help her. But the other part, the part that had lived through a year of loneliness, a year of the pain she had caused him, held him back. He wasn't ready to be her savior, not when he was just beginning to piece his life back together. "I can help you with the paperwork," he said finally, his voice cool and businesslike. "If you need a lawyer for a labor dispute or something, I can look at the paperwork, give advice. But that's all, Claire. There's nothing else I can offer." She looked at him, her eyes full of a mixture of gratitude and disappointment. "Thank you," she said quietly. That's something." Sam nodded, his gaze sliding to the crowd that continued to buzz around them. He felt the moment tightening, like a string about to snap. He didn't know what to say next, didn't know if he wanted to continue this conversation. Claire stood before him, so familiar and so foreign, and he knew their story wasn't over, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to write the next chapter. "I have to go," he said, taking a step back. "Good luck, Claire. Really." She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and she turned away, her figure disappearing into the shadows of the room. Sam watched her go, his heart beating unevenly, but he didn't move. He knew this conversation was just the beginning, but what would happen next, he couldn't even imagine. New York City was waking up to a gray sky, the clouds hanging low as if they were about to squeeze out rain. Sam walked through the busy streets, his coat damp from the morning drizzle, his briefcase weighing down his shoulder. He was headed to the office, but his mind was elsewhere, returning to Claire, to their chance encounter at a charity event a week ago. The image of her pale face, threadbare jacket, shaky voice was constant, despite his best efforts to focus on his work. He told himself that she was no longer his concern, that her life, her mistakes, her fall were her choice. But something in her eyes, in her admission that she was at rock bottom, clung to him like a splinter. Rumors about Claire had reached him without him knowingly seeking them out. Mike, his co-worker and gossip king, mentioned seeing Claire at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, where she was working behind the counter, serving coffee and sandwiches. "She looked like she hadn't slept in a week," Mike said, shaking his head, and Sam nodded, trying not to show how hurt he was. He later learned from Lisa, Claire's friend from Herald, that she was sleeping over at friends' houses, doing odd jobs, freelancing for small websites, working part-time at a cafe, or even helping to organize events. Claire, who had once written life-changing articles, was now taking on anything that could bring in a few dollars. The thought was almost incomprehensible, as if someone had erased it from reality and replaced it with a pale copy. Sam tried to push the news away, but it seeped into his mind like a cold wind through a cracked window. He didn't want to think about her, didn't want to feel responsible for her fate, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her not the Claire who'd left him, but the one who'd been there when they'd started, the one who'd laughed when he'd spilled coffee on her notebook on their second date, the one who'd read her articles out loud to him while he cooked dinner, the one who'd held him in the dark, whispering that they could handle anything if they were together. That evening, back at his apartment, Sam dropped his briefcase on the couch and opened the refrigerator, but he didn't want anything. He poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table, which was now smaller and simpler than the one where he and Claire had eaten dinner. His gaze fell on a stack of papers, among which was the postcard from Portland that Claire had sent months ago. He hadn't opened it since he'd received it, but now he reached for it, as if it might hold answers. Sorry for everything. Kay. The words written in her hand still cut, but not as deeply as before. He put the card down and closed his eyes, letting the memories roll over him like waves. He remembered their first trip together, a weekend in Vermont where they'd rented a tiny house by a lake. Claire had insisted on going hiking, despite his protests that he wasn't cut out for the woods. They'd gotten lost, of course, and spent 3 hours arguing over the map until they found the trail, but then they'd sat around the fire laughing at their clumsiness, her hair smelling of smoke and pine. He remembered their first anniversary, when they'd spent the last of their savings on dinner at an expensive restaurant that served oysters, which they both hated but pretended to like so as not to look foolish. He remembered her crying when her mother died, and how he'd held her all night, not saying a word because words weren't necessary. The memories were vivid, but they weren't his anymore. They were like old photographs you smile at but can't bring back the moment they were taken. Sam knew the Claire he loved was gone, or maybe she'd never existed the way he'd imagined. But it still hurt to think that she, the woman who'd once been his world, was now sleeping on people's couches, serving coffee at a diner. The next day, Sam was drinking coffee at his Stitch Fix office when his phone vibrated with a new email. He put his cup down and opened his laptop, expecting another reminder from a client, but instead found an envelope with an unfamiliar address. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the return address, a small apartment in Brooklyn where he knew Claire's friend Lisa lived. He tore the envelope open, his fingers shaking slightly. Inside was a piece of paper covered in her handwriting, scribbled but familiar. Dear Sam, I thought for a long time whether to write this letter. I know that you don't want to see me, and I don't blame you. But I have to say this because I didn't say it then at the reception, and it doesn't give me peace. I made a mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. I left you thinking I was looking for something better, but I was wrong. Evan was an illusion, and you were real. I ruined our lives, and I can't forgive myself for it. I lost everything, my job, my reputation, my sense of self. But worst of all, I lost you. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. I live with this every day, and it's harder than I ever imagined. I don't know where I'm going to go from here, but I'm trying to pick myself up again. Thank you for listening to me then. It's more than I deserved. Claire. Sam read the letter 3 times, his throat tightening. Her words were sincere, but they couldn't erase the pain she had caused him. He felt no anger, the anger had long since burned out, but there was no pity either. There was only weariness, mixed with sadness for what might have been. He folded the letter and put it in a drawer, not knowing if he would ever answer it. Sam moved on with his life, but the news about Claire haunted him. Lisa told him over the phone that Claire was working at a bar in Williamsburg, living on her couch and trying to find a steady job. She's not giving up, Lisa said, but she's having a hard time. She doesn't want to bother you, but I think it was important for her to write to you. Sam thanked her for the information, but made no promises. He thought about Claire every day, but not in the same way he had before. Not in dreams of reconciliation, but in reflections on how life could break even the strongest. He saw himself in her, someone who had once been broken, but had found the strength to move on. He didn't know if she could do the same, but he hoped she could. One evening, while sitting at dinner with Rebecca, he told her about the letter. She listened silently, her eyes attentive but not judgmental. "What are you going to do?" she asked when he finished. Sam shrugged. "Nothing. I offered to help her with the paperwork, and that's all I can do. She'll have to find her own way." Rebecca nodded, her hand coming to rest on his. "You're a good man, Sam." Better than most. He smiled faintly, but did not answer. He did not feel good. He felt like a man standing on the border between the past and the future, unsure how to take the final step. But he knew he would not for Claire, but for himself. Sam sat at his desk, staring at the screen of his laptop, where the cursor blinked on a blank document. Outside, New York City hummed with its familiar symphony taxi horns, snatches of conversation, the distant wail of sirens. But his office was silent, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioner. On the desk in front of him was a letter from Claire, her neat but slightly shaky handwriting still giving him a strange feeling, a mixture of nostalgia and fatigue. He hadn't opened it since the night he first read it, but it drew his gaze like a magnet. Sam knew he should throw it away, put it out of his life, the way he'd put her photos and things out of his life, but something stopped him. Maybe it was hope not that the past would return, but that he could finally close the chapter. His phone vibrated, startling him out of his thoughts. A message from Claire. Sam, I know I don't deserve your time, but I'd like to meet. Just talk. Please think about it. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He hadn't answered her email, hadn't called her since their meeting at the charity event, but her words, I have nothing, Sam still echoed in his head. He didn't want to be her savior, but he couldn't ignore her entirely. Not because he still loved her, that had long ago transformed into something more complicated, but because he was tired of carrying around the bitterness that was poisoning his life. Sam put his phone down and rubbed his temples. He thought about Rebecca, her quiet support, the way she'd helped him move on. He thought about his life, finally taking shape after a year of chaos. And he thought about Claire, not the one who'd left, but the one who'd stood before him a week ago, broken but still trying to cling to life. He didn't know what she wanted, but he felt he owed her at least an ear. Not for her sake, but for his own for closure, for the shadow that still followed him. He typed a short reply, okay, tomorrow, 6 p.m., cafe on the corner of 5th and 23rd. No lateness. As he pressed send, he felt the tension in his chest ease slightly, as if he had taken the first step towards something unknown. The next day, Sam arrived early at the cafe, taking a table by the window. It was a small place with wooden tables and the smell of freshly brewed coffee, where he and Claire had once enjoyed weekend breakfasts. He had chosen it not out of sentimentality, but because it was neutral territory, not his office, not her temporary home at Lisa's, but a place where they could just be two people talking without the past weighing them down. Claire walked in promptly at 6, her steps cautious, as if she were afraid to frighten the moment. She wore the same shabby jacket she had worn at the reception, but her hair was neatly pulled back, and there was something about her posture that resembled her old confidence. She spotted him and smiled faintly, but her eyes were wary, as if she were expecting a blow. "Thank you for coming," she said, sitting down opposite him. Her voice was quiet but firm, as if she had rehearsed these words. "I know this isn't easy for you." Sam nodded, his hands resting on the table, his fingers intertwined. "I'm here," he said, his tone neutral but not hostile. "What did you want to discuss?" Claire took a deep breath, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "I've been thinking a lot since we met," she began, "about what I said to you, about how things turned out. I can't change the past, Sam, but I want you to know that I understand how much I hurt you, and I want—" She trailed off, her gaze falling to the table. "I want us to be able to move forward somehow. Not together, that's not what I mean, but without this wall between us." Sam looked at her, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Walls?" he asked, a slight edge to his voice. "Claire, you built that wall when you left. I'm just trying to move on. What do you expect from me? Forgiveness? Forgetfulness?" She shook her head, her eyes shining, but she held on. "Not forgiveness," she said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want us to be able to talk without every word feeling like a knife. I saw a therapist, Sam, not long ago when I realized I couldn't cope, and he suggested an idea of family therapy, not to bring us back, but to sort things out, to close this chapter the right way." Sam leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening. Family therapy, he repeated, his tone skeptical. Claire, we're not a family. We're divorced. You left, chose someone else. Why do we need this? She swallowed, her fingers tightening on the napkin. Because I see the way you look at me, she said quietly. You don't hate me, but you're still holding on to this pain. And I do too. I don't want either of us to carry this forever. Therapy might help us. Let go. Talk about what happened without anger. I know it sounds weird, but I think it might help us both. Sam was silent, his gaze drifting to the window where people were hurrying under umbrellas. The idea of therapy seemed ridiculous to him, sitting in a room with a stranger, delving into their past, their mistakes. He didn't want to go back there, to those nights when he couldn't sleep, to those days when her absence was a physical pain. But there was something in her words that touched him. He did carry that pain, that bitterness that, though dulled, still poisoned his life. He thought of Rebecca, of how she deserved all of him, not half of him, of how he deserved to be free. I'm not doing this for you, he said finally, his voice firm but not malicious. If I agree, it will be for me, so I can finally stop looking back. But don't expect me to be your friend, Claire. I'm not ready for that. She nodded, her face softening and a glimmer of relief in her eyes. I understand, she said, and I'm not looking for friendship. I just want us both to be able to breathe more freely. Sam looked at her, trying to find the lie in her face, but he saw only tired sincerity. He didn't trust her completely, there were too many wounds, but he trusted himself. He knew he didn't want to be a prisoner of their past anymore. Therapy was a risky move, but maybe it was a way to finally put an end to it. Okay, he said, I'll think about it. Give me your psychologist's contact, but I'm not promising anything. Claire pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to him. Her fingers shook slightly as she handed it over. Thank you, Sam, she whispered. This is more than I could have hoped for. He took the card without looking at it and put it in his pocket. I have to go, he said, standing up. Good luck, Claire. She nodded, her lips pursed into a weak smile, and she remained seated as he left the cafe, his steps quick, as if he were afraid to change his mind. The rain had picked up outside, and Sam pulled up the collar of his coat, feeling the cold drops trickle down his face. He didn't know if he'd made the right decision, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he'd taken a step forward, not toward Claire, but toward himself. That evening, sitting in his apartment, Sam pulled out a business card and looked at it. The psychologist's name, Dr. Elizabeth Carter, was printed in neat font, next to the address of a practice downtown. He set the card on the table and poured himself a whiskey, but he didn't drink, just stared at the amber liquid, thinking. He thought about how far he'd come in the past year, about how Rebecca had made him feel alive again, about how tired he was of the weight he still carried. Therapy could be a waste of time, or it could be the key to finally letting go of Claire, not from his mind, but from his heart. He called Rebecca and told her about the meeting, about Claire's offer. She listened attentively, as always, her voice calm but warm. It's your choice, Sam, she said, but if it helps you get rid of what's holding you back, I think it's worth a try. He nodded, though she couldn't see him. I think so too, he said, but I'm doing this for myself, not for her. I know, she replied, and he heard the smile in her voice. You're stronger than you think. Sam hung up and looked at the card again. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Not for Claire, not for their past, but for the future he wanted to build free of pain, free of bitterness, free of the shadows that had haunted him for too long. New York City was bathed in golden autumn light. The leaves in Central Park were ablaze with orange and red, and the air smelled of dampness and the promise of change. Sam walked down the sidewalk toward Dr. Elizabeth Carter's office, his steps measured but his chest throbbing with tension. He had agreed to couples therapy a week ago after meeting Claire at a coffee shop, but every step toward her office had felt like a trial. He wasn't sure what to expect: relief, pain, or just emptiness. But he knew he had to try, not for Claire's sake, but for his own, to finally free himself from the chains of the past that still held him back. Dr. Carter's office was on the sixth floor of an old building in the center of town, with windows overlooking a busy street. The room was cozy, but not in an intrusive way. A soft couch, a couple of armchairs, shelves of books, and a lone ficus in the corner. There was a box of tissues on the desk, a tacit admission that tears were common here. Sam arrived first, as always, and sat in the chair by the window, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. Claire came in a few minutes later, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail and wearing a new jacket, not the shabby one he'd seen at the reception, but plain but neat. She looked a little better than she had last time, but her eyes still betrayed a tired look. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, sitting down on the sofa opposite him. Her voice was cautious, as if she was afraid to frighten the moment. Sam nodded, his gaze sliding to Dr. Carter, a woman in her 50s with warm eyes and a calm smile. She sat between them, her notebook in her lap, but she was in no hurry to open it. "Okay," Dr. Carter began, her voice soft but firm. "We're here to talk honestly, even when it's hard. Sam, Claire, I want you both to feel safe speaking your minds. There are no right or wrong answers. Let's start with why you're here. Sam, do you want to begin?" Sam took a deep breath, his fingers stilling. He looked at Claire, then at his hands. "I'm here because I want to move on," he said, his voice even but heavy. "I'm tired of carrying this pain. I don't want to hate Claire, but I don't want to pretend everything's okay. I just want peace." Claire swallowed, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "I'm here because I know what I did," she said, her voice shaking. "I ruined our lives, Sam, and I want to understand why I did it, so I don't make the same mistakes again. And I want you to know that I'm sorry. I really am." Dr. Carter nodded, her gaze shifting between them. "Okay, that's a start. Let's try to dig deeper. Sam, how do you feel when Claire says she's sorry?" Sam hesitated, his jaw tense. He didn't want to answer, didn't want to open that door, but he knew he had to. "I don't know," he admitted. "I believe you're sorry, Claire, but that doesn't change what you did. You left, chose someone else, and I'm left picking up the pieces. I don't know how to just forgive that." Claire looked down, her lip trembling. "I know," she whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I lost myself. I thought Evan was the answer, but he was just an escape." Sam looked at her, his chest tightening. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want to understand it, but her words were tugging at something inside him. He remembered the way she talked about her work, how alive she felt when she wrote, how her eyes lit up when she told him about a new case. That Claire had disappeared long before Evan, and he might not have noticed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice quieter but still hurt. "We were together for 12 years. If you were losing yourself, why didn't you come to me?" Tears streamed down Claire's cheeks, and she made no attempt to wipe them away. "Because I didn't know how," she admitted. "I thought I had to cope on my own. I thought if I told you I was feeling bad, you'd think I was weak, or that you weren't enough for me. And you were enough, Sam. I was the one who was out of place." Dr. Carter intervened, her voice gentle but guiding. "Claire, I think you're saying you felt disconnected from Sam, but you didn't know how to express it. Sam, how does it make you feel to hear that?" Sam gripped the arms of his chair, his eyes glued to the window. "I feel anger," he said finally. "Because I was there, Claire. I was willing to listen, willing to help. But you chose to leave instead of talking. And now you're sitting here, crying, and I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? I don't know how." Claire nodded, tears dripping onto her jeans. "I don't expect pity," she said. "I just want you to know that I understand what I did, and I'm trying to be a better person. Not for you, but for me." The sessions continued weekly, and each one was a minefield. Sometimes the conversations were calm, almost analytical, as they discussed their marriage, their mistakes, the times they could have done things differently. Other times they were stormy, full of accusations and tears. In one session, Sam talked about how he'd felt since she'd left, the sleepless nights, the emptiness of the apartment, how he'd hated himself for not noticing her pain. Claire cried as she listened, her hands shaking as she reached for a tissue. "I didn't know," she said then. "I thought you could handle it. You were always so strong." "I wasn't strong," he snapped. "I was broken, Claire. You just didn't see it because you were too busy with your new life." Dr. Carter helped them work through these moments, guiding the conversation, asking questions that forced them to look at themselves and each other in new ways. Sam began to understand that his anger was not just about Claire's betrayal, but also about his own guilt for not noticing how she was drifting away, for allowing their marriage to become routine. Claire, for her part, began to talk about her fear of failure, how her ambitions in journalism had turned into pressure she couldn't bear, and how she had sought refuge in Evan, thinking he would bring her back to life. In one of their sessions, a month later, Sam suddenly realized that he still loved Claire, but not in the passionate, all-consuming way they had when they were younger. It was a different feeling, more mature, mixed with sadness and understanding. He loved her as someone who had been a part of his life, who had helped shape him, even if that part was now in the past. This discovery was painful, but liberating. It meant he could let her go without losing himself. "I don't hate you," he told her during that session, his voice quiet but firm. "I thought I did, but I didn't. I just want us both to be free." Claire looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but she smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Thank you," she whispered. "It means more than you know." Along with her therapy, Claire began to change. She found a job not in journalism, but at a nonprofit that helped women in distress. It was a modest position, writing grants and organizing events, but it gave her purpose. She moved out of Lisa's apartment into the smallest studio she could afford in Brooklyn and began volunteering at a homeless shelter on weekends. These were small steps, but for Claire, they were like taking her first breaths after being underwater for so long. She talked about it in sessions, her voice growing more confident. "I'm not trying to atone," she said one day. "I just want to be a person I can be proud of. I lost that somewhere along the way." Sam listened, and though he didn't want to admit it, he respected her efforts. He saw her struggle, clinging to every small step forward, and it reminded him of the Claire he once loved, stubborn, unyielding. But he kept his distance, not allowing himself to get too close. This wasn't his fight, and he didn't want to be a part of her life again. By the end of the third month of therapy, Sam felt something had changed. The bitterness that had lingered inside him for so long began to dissolve, like fog in the morning sun. He still felt pain when he thought about their marriage, but it no longer defined him. He could talk about Claire without anger, could remember their past without wanting to erase it. He began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing her actions, but about releasing himself from their weight. At their final session, Dr. Carter asked them what they wanted now. Claire answered first, her voice calm but firm. "I want to keep growing," she said. "I want to be better for myself and for anyone I can help. And I want Sam to be happy, even if it's not with me." Sam looked at her, his heart clenching, not with pain, but with something new, reconciliation. "I want the same thing," he said. "I want to live without this burden. And I want you to find your way, Claire. Not for me, but for you." Dr. Carter smiled, closing her notebook. "You've both done a great job," she said. "Forgiveness isn't the end of the road, it's the beginning. You're ready for it." Sam and Claire left the office together, but paused at the elevator, unsure of what to say. For the first time in a long time, there was no tension between them, just a quiet understanding. "Good luck, Claire," Sam said, and his voice was sincere. "And you too, Sam," she replied, her smile weak but real. They went their separate ways, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. Sam knew this wasn't the end of their story, but it was the end of their pain. He walked down the street, feeling the autumn wind on his face, and for the first time in years, he breathed freely, ready for what lay ahead. As fall gave way to the first chill of November in New York City, the city had transformed. Fallen leaves covered the streets, The air was crisp, and storefronts were starting to light up with Christmas lights, even though the holidays were still far away. Sam walked through Central Park, his breath steaming, the scarf Rebecca had given him wrapped tightly around his neck. He felt lighter than he had in 2 years, as if the invisible weight he had been carrying since Claire left had finally melted away. Therapy with Dr. Carter, the hard conversations, the tears and moments of honesty had taken their toll. Sam was no longer a prisoner of his past. He had forgiven Claire, not for her sake, but for his own, and that forgiveness had been the key to a door he had been unable to open for so long. A month had passed since their last session, and Sam's life was beginning to take shape. He was still seeing Rebecca, their relationship quiet but deep, built on mutual respect and understanding. He was working on a big case at the firm that promised to make his name even more famous in legal circles, and he had even begun to write not letters, as he had done before, but essays that he hadn't shown to anyone yet, but which helped him sort out his thoughts. But Claire, despite his efforts to move on, remained a part of his world, not as a pain, but as a quiet echo, a reminder of who he had been and who he had become. One evening, while sitting in his apartment, Sam received a message from Claire. It was short but unexpected. "Sam, I know we agreed to stay out of each other's lives, but I'd like to meet up. Nothing serious, just. I think we have a lot to talk about. Maybe coffee on Saturday." He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of him wanted to back out, to maintain the distance he had so carefully built. But another part of him, the part that remembered their best moments, their laughter, their dreams, wanted to give her a chance. Not to bring back the past, but to do something new, something honest. He replied, "Okay, Saturday, 10 a.m., same cafe. But no lateness." After sending the message, he felt a little nervous, but not afraid. This was not a return to the old, but a step into the unknown. On Saturday morning, Sam showed up at the cafe on the corner of 5th and 23rd as he had promised. Claire was already there, sitting by the window with a cup of tea. She looked better than the last time they had seen each other. Her hair was neatly done, she was wearing a new forest green jacket, and there was a sparkle in her eyes that he hadn't seen since their first years together. She smiled when she saw him, and it wasn't a forced smile, but a genuine one, almost like old times. "You came," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "I was afraid you'd change your mind." Sam sat down opposite, taking off his coat. "I said I'd come," he replied, his tone light, but with a hint of seriousness. "What did you want to discuss?" Claire took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the cup. "I've been thinking about us a lot," she began. "What we've been through, what I've done, and I realized I don't want our story to end in pain. We were more than that, Sam. We were—" She hesitated, searching for the words. "We were each other's home, even if I destroyed it." Sam looked at her, his heart beating more steadily than he expected. "We were," he agreed. "But that's the past, Claire. We can't go back there." "I don't want to go back," she said quickly. "That's not what I mean. I want us to be in each other's lives, not as enemies, not as exes, but as people who know each other better than anyone. I don't expect you to forgive me completely, but I want to try to start over. Not a marriage, not a relationship, but something honest." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sliding toward the window where people were going about their business. Her words touched something inside him, but not in the same way they had before. He no longer felt anger, no longer felt pain. He felt possibility. Not the passionate, reckless love that had bound them together in their youth, but something more mature, more conscious. He forgave her not with words, but with his whole being, and that forgiveness set him free. "I don't hold it against you, Claire," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I've forgiven you, not because you deserved it, but because I'm tired of living with this burden. But if you want to start over, it has to be honest. No lies, no running away. I don't know what that will be, but I'm willing to try." Her eyes widened and she nodded, her lips twitching into a smile. "Honestly," she repeated, "I promise." A week later, Sam and Claire decided to go to Vermont, to the same lake house where they had spent their first weekend together. It wasn't an attempt to recapture the past, but a way to honor it, to create a new memory that wouldn't be tainted by pain. They agreed that it would be just a trip, two people who knew each other better than anyone, trying to find common ground. The drive was long but quiet. They drove in a rental car, the radio playing old rock ballads softly as the forests flashed past, covered in gold and crimson. Sam held the wheel and Claire sat next to him, looking out the window, occasionally commenting on the scenery or recalling funny memories from their past. They didn't talk about the divorce or Evan or the pain. They talked about the little things, the books they'd read, her new job at a nonprofit, his marathons. It was easy, almost natural, like they were learning how to be together all over again. The lake house hadn't changed much over the years. Wooden walls, a threadbare couch, a fireplace that still smelled of smoke. They spent the day walking through the woods, reminiscing about how they'd once gotten lost there, laughing as Sam tried to read a map and Claire insisted she knew the way. That evening, they lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the porch, looking out at the lake, the stars reflecting off it. "Remember how we dreamed of buying a house like this?" Claire asked, her voice soft, almost dreamy. "We said we'd come here every summer." Sam smiled, looking out at the water. "Yeah, I thought we'd be old and gray, sitting here with a bunch of grandkids running around." She laughed, but there was sadness in her laughter. "I ruined that dream, didn't I?" He shook his head, his gaze serious but warm. "No, we both changed her. But maybe we can create a new one. Not like the old one, but ours." Claire looked at him, her eyes glittering in the firelight. "I'd like that," she said quietly, "but only if we're honest. I don't want any more mistakes." "Me too," he said, and there was determination in his voice. "But we won't rush. Step by step, Claire, and only honestly." She nodded, her hand brushing his, and this time he didn't pull away. They sat in silence, looking out at the lake, and there was no tension in that silence, only the promise of something new. Not marriage, not love as they had known it before, but something else: friendship, respect, a connection that had survived their mistakes and could now become something more. Back in New York, Sam and Claire continued to see each other, not as a couple, but as two people learning to trust each other again. They went for coffee, exchanged text messages, and sometimes walked around the city together. Sam told Rebecca about the trip, about how he and Claire were trying to build something new. Rebecca, as always, was understanding but honest. "I'm glad you found peace," she said. "But be careful, Sam. Not for me, but for yourself." He knew she was right, and he was careful. But he also knew that with Claire, they had a chance, not an old flame, but something more mature, built on honesty and forgiveness. Claire continued to work in her organization, her eyes beginning to sparkle again, as they had in their youth, when she talked about projects that helped people. Sam was proud of her, but he kept his distance, allowing their connection to grow slowly, naturally. The city around them had a life of its own, but for Sam and Claire, it was a place of new beginnings. They didn't know where their path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, they were ready to walk it together, not as husband and wife, but as two people who had weathered a storm and were learning to see the sun again. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.